Some stories don't begin with grand declarations or sweeping romances. They begin with dust on a window, a letter read too many times, and the quiet terror of stepping toward a life you chose but cannot imagine. This is a story for those who've ever felt they weren't quite enough, not pretty enough, not polished enough, not whatever enough the world seemed to demand. It's for folks who've learned that the truest gifts often come wrapped in plain brown paper. Clara's journey westward wasn't about finding love. It was about finding out whether honesty could be enough when beauty had never been an option. Perhaps you'll recognize something of yourself in her worn calico dress and work-roughened hands. Perhaps you won't. Either way, I hope you'll sit a spell and stay a while. The stagecoach hit another rut, and Clara Morley's teeth clacked together hard enough to taste copper. She pressed her palm flat against the cracked leather seat. Steadying herself as the Concorde lurched sideways, the wood and iron groaned like an old man's bones on a cold morning. Across from her, a woman in lavender silk clutched a hat box to her chest, like a child holding a favorite doll. The woman's gloves were spotless. White kid leather. Not a stain, not a tear, not a single thread loose at the seams. Clara looked down at her own hands. The calluses had yellowed where they'd thickened. Her nails were trimmed short and uneven. She'd done them herself with her mother's old scissors 3 days ago. In a boarding house room that smelled of mildew and boiled cabbage, there was still a faint bruise on her right thumb from where she'd caught it in the laundry wringer last month. Hands like these didn't belong in white gloves. She tucked them beneath the folds of her brown calico skirt and turned toward the window. The glass was so thick with dust that Wyoming looked faded and brown, like everything had been left out in the sun too long. Nothing but browns and yellows and the occasional smudge of sage green bleeding through the grime. Lord, give me strength, she prayed silently. 3 more hours, maybe 4. The letter was in her pocket. She didn't need to read it again. She'd memorized every word during the 3-week journey from Massachusetts, had traced the angular handwriting with her fingertip until the paper grew soft and thin at the creases. I need a woman who can work. I don't need anything else. Wyatt Hollis, a rancher in Bitter Creek, Wyoming, 34 years old, widowed twice. According to the marriage broker's notes, though, the broker had been careful not to elaborate on how or why those marriages had ended. Some questions, apparently, weren't worth asking when a man owned 40 acres and 100 head of cattle. Clara had asked anyway. The broker, a pinched woman named Mrs. Adelaide Crane, who operated out of a cramped office above a milliner's shop in Boston, had pursed her lips and shuffled her papers. Mr. Hollis is a private man, she'd said. He doesn't share personal matters with strangers. I won't be a stranger, Clara had pointed out. I'll be his wife. Mrs. Crane had looked at her, then really looked, her gaze traveling from Clara's faded bonnet to her sensible boots, with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock at auction. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, though not in a flattering way. You'll do, she'd said, and slid the contract across the desk. The memory made Clara's stomach tighten. She shifted on the hard seat, felt the letter crinkle against her hip, and forced herself to breathe slowly. You'll do. Not you're perfect, or you're exactly what he's looking for, or even you seem like a sensible match. Just you'll do. Like she was a replacement part for a broken machine functional. Adequate, nothing more. Well, that was fair. Wasn't it? Clara hadn't applied to be anyone's dream. She'd applied because the factory in Lowell had closed. because her mother's medical bills had eaten through every penny of savings, because the only other option was the workhouse, or worse. She'd applied because Wyatt Hollis wanted a woman who could work. And Clara could work. That was the one thing she'd always been able to do. The woman in lavender silk was watching her. Clara pretended not to notice. She kept her gaze fixed on the dusty window, on the endless stretch of prairie rolling past like a brown wool blanket spread across the earth. But she could feel those eyes curious, pitying, faintly superior, cataloging every detail of her appearance. The dress was clean but old, washed so many times the fabric had grown thin at the elbows. The bonnet was practical, not fashionable, made of sturdy cotton rather than the delicate straws and silks that graced the heads of proper ladies. And her face. Clara's hand moved involuntarily toward her cheek, then stopped. She knew what was there. She'd known since she was 7 years old, and Billy Patterson had pointed at her across the schoolyard and shouted "Freckleface" loud enough for everyone to hear. The spots had only multiplied since then, spreading across her nose and cheeks and forehead like a map of some country no one wanted to visit. Her mother had tried everything: lemon juice, buttermilk compresses, a foul-smelling paste made from horseradish that had left Clara's skin raw and burning for days. Nothing worked. "Some faces are meant to be noticed for other reasons," her mother had said once, near the end, when the consumption had stolen most of her breath but none of her gentleness. "Yours is an honest face, Clara. That's worth more than pretty." Clara had nodded and smiled and pretended to believe it. But she'd been 23 then, and she was 26 now, and no one in 3 years had given her any reason to think her mother was right. "Lord, let him be kind," she prayed. "I don't ask for love, just kindness." The stagecoach shuddered to a stop. Clara's heart lurched sideways in her chest. She gripped the edge of the seat, knuckles whitening, as the driver's voice filtered down from above. Bitter Creek. 20 minutes for those continuing on. 20 minutes. Not a final destination for everyone. Then just a brief pause. A chance to stretch legs and empty bladders before the coach continued its journey to wherever civilized people actually wanted to go. But for Clara, this was it. End of the line. She gathered her single carpet bag. The handles were fraying. She noticed. Another thing she'd need to mend when she found a moment and waited for the other passengers to disembark first. The lavender woman swept past without a glance, her silk skirts rustling importantly. A man in a bowler hat followed, then a young couple who'd spent most of the journey making eyes at each other over their respective books. Clara was last. She climbed down from the coach carefully, one hand gripping the iron rail, and felt the ground solid beneath her feet for the first time in hours. Her legs wobbled, her back ached, her mouth tasted of dust and old coffee, and there was a crick in her neck that would probably take days to work out. But she was here. Bitter Creek, Wyoming. She looked around. The town, if it could be called that, consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings arranged along a single dirt street, a general store with a faded sign, a blacksmith shop, judging by the ring of hammer on iron drifting from somewhere behind the main structure, a small church with a crooked steeple, its whitewash peeling in the relentless sun, and scattered among them, a handful of houses and what might have been a saloon, though Clara couldn't be certain from this angle. That was all. No grand hotels, no bustling marketplaces, no tree-lined avenues filled with carriages and well-dressed pedestrians, just wood and dust and endless sky. bigger and bluer than any sky Clara had ever seen, stretching from horizon to horizon like the good Lord had used up all his paint on this one corner of the world. It was beautiful, she realized with a start. Beautiful and terrifying and absolutely nothing like home. "You, Clara?" The voice came from her left, low, flat as a Kansas prairie. Clara turned. He was standing beside a wagon hitched to a pair of tired-looking horses, a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same brown rock that dotted the prairie. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but she could see the hard line of his jaw, the sun-weathered skin, the way he held himself very still. Like a man who'd learned that movement attracted attention he didn't want. This was him. It had to be. Wyatt Hollis. Clara swallowed. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "Yes," she managed. "I'm Clara." He didn't move. Didn't smile. Didn't offer his hand, or tip his hat, or do any of the dozen small courtesies that a man was supposed to extend when meeting his future wife for the first time. He just looked at her. And in that long, silent moment, Clara felt every inadequacy she'd ever possessed rise to the surface like cream separating from milk. The freckles, the calloused hands, the worn dress and practical bonnet and complete, utter lack of anything that might be called feminine charm. She opened her mouth. "I'm not pretty," she heard herself say. The words came out thin, almost whispered, like a confession dragged from a guilty conscience. "I know the photograph Mrs. Crane sent didn't show my face clearly, and I should have told you before, but I thought maybe if I just came, if you could see that I can work, that I'm strong, and I'm honest, and She stopped. Wyatt Hollis had turned away from her. For one horrible, plummeting moment. Clara thought he was leaving, thought he'd taken one look at her freckled face and decided that no amount of hard work could compensate for a woman who looked like she'd been splattered with mud as a child and never quite washed clean. But he wasn't leaving. He was reaching into the wagon. When he turned back, he was holding a tin cup, battered, dented, with a chip missing from the rim and a faint stain of rust creeping up one side. He held it out toward her, and Clara saw the steam rising from its contents coffee. Hot and dark and strong. She stared at it. "Long ride," Wyatt said. His voice was still flat, but there was something in it now that hadn't been there before. Something that might have been patience or understanding. She couldn't rightly tell. "You must be thirsty." Clara took the cup. Her fingers brushed against his rough calluses, meeting rough calluses. Working hands recognizing their own kind, and she felt something shift in her chest. A loosening. Maybe, or a tightening. She couldn't decide which. "Thank you," she whispered. Wyatt nodded. He was already turning toward the wagon, reaching for her carpet bag with hands that moved with the efficient economy of a man who never wasted motion. "Drink it while it's hot," he said over his shoulder. "Coffee's no good cold." Clara lifted the cup to her lips. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, bitter as regret, and hotter than anything had a right to be in this heat. But she drank it anyway, standing there in the dust of Bitter Creek with her carpet bag being loaded into a stranger's wagon, and tried to understand what had just happened. She'd told him she wasn't pretty. He'd given her coffee. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't anything she could point to and say, "See, it's going to be all right." But it wasn't rejection, either. It wasn't the dismissal she'd spent 3 weeks preparing herself for. The inevitable moment when he'd take one look at her honest face and send her back where she came from. He'd given her coffee. She finished the last bitter swallow and looked up to find him watching her. Still no expression on that weathered face. Still no hint of what he might be thinking. But he was watching, and he hadn't looked away. And when she handed the empty cup back to him, their fingers brushed again. "Ready?" he asked. Clara thought about the life she was leaving behind, the cramped boarding house rooms, the factory floors slick with oil, the endless gray sameness of days that blurred together like watercolors left out in the rain. She thought about her mother's grave, still unmarked because there hadn't been money for a proper stone. She thought about the letter in her pocket. Read so many times the words had worn themselves into her memory. "I need a woman who can work." "Yes," she said. The wagon seat was hard. The leather cracked and sun-bleached. The horses were slow, their hooves kicking up small clouds of dust with each plodding step. And Wyatt Hollis didn't speak a single word as they left Bitter Creek behind and headed out into the endless, terrifying, beautiful prairie. But Clara was still holding the tin cup. She held it all the way home. If this beginning stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, perhaps a journey of your own, I'd be honored to know where you're reading from today. As the old folks used to say, good company makes the road feel shorter. The farmhouse emerged from the prairie like a wound. Clara saw it first as a dark smudge against the orange sky, small, solitary, hunched low to the ground, as if bracing against winds that hadn't yet arrived. As the wagon drew closer, details sharpened into focus. Weathered boards gone gray with age, a roof that sagged slightly on one side, windows like empty eye sockets, catching the last light of day and throwing it back without warmth. The horses' hooves crunched against dry earth. No grass here, just cracked dirt stretching in every direction, split into patterns that reminded Clara of the lines on an old woman's palm. Wyatt pulled the wagon to a stop beside a water trough. The trough was empty, bone dry. Clara climbed down before he could offer help. Her boots hit the ground, raising a small cloud of dust that settled on the hem of her dress. She brushed at it automatically, then stopped. What was the point? The porch held a single rocking chair. She stared at it. One chair, worn smooth on the armrests. The wood darkened where hands had gripped it night after night, year after year. A ghost of movement seemed to cling to it, the memory of someone sitting alone, watching the sun sink below the horizon with no one to share the silence. "Kitchen's through there." Wyatt's voice came from behind her. He was lifting her carpet bag from the wagon, his movements quick and efficient. "Bedroom's in the back, outhouses around the side." He walked past her onto the porch. Boots heavy on the boards. Clara followed. Inside, the air tasted stale and close. Dust motes drifted in the dying light from the windows, suspended like tiny ghosts. She saw a cast-iron stove crusted with old grease, smelling faintly of bacon fat gone rancid. A table with 2 chairs, though one was pushed against the wall as if it hadn't been used in years. Shelves holding tin plates, a coffee pot, a single frying pan, no curtains, no flowers, no photographs on the walls. And there, on a shelf in the corner, a Bible. Dust lay thick on its cover. Hadn't been touched in a long while, Clara reckoned. Nothing soft here, nothing alive. "Water's been low," Wyatt said. He was at the stove now, striking a match. The flame caught, throwing dancing shadows across his face. The smell of sulfur stung Clara's nose. "Well's been dry 2 years. I haul what we need from town." 2 years. Clara absorbed this. 2 years of hauling water, of watching the land crack and split, of sitting alone on that single porch chair while the world turned brown and brittle around him. "The garden," she started. "Out back, did you used to?" He didn't look at her. "Not anymore." Clara moved to the window, through the grimy glass. She could see what might once have been garden plots, raised beds now filled with nothing but dust and a few skeletal weeds that had given up the fight long ago. Her fingers pressed against the sill. The wood was rough, unpolished, thirsty for the oil it had never received. How long since anyone had cared for this place? How long since it had felt like a home, instead of just shelter from the wind behind her? The stove began to crackle. The smell of coffee drifted through the room, cutting through the staleness. "Your room's through there." Wyatt nodded toward a narrow doorway covered by a faded curtain, its flower pattern bleached almost white by years of sun. "I'll sleep in the barn." Clara turned to face him. "You don't have to. I'll sleep in the barn." His voice left no room for argument. He was already moving toward the door, his hat pulled low, his shoulders set in that rigid line she was beginning to recognize as his way of holding himself together. "Mr. Hollis." He stopped, didn't turn. "The garden," Clara said quietly. "The one that used to be there. What did you grow?" Silence stretched between them like a held breath. The stove crackled. Outside, one of the horses stamped its hoof against the hard ground, and somewhere far off, a coyote began its evening song. "Everything," Wyatt said finally. His voice had changed, gone rough at the edges, like cloth rubbed too many times against a washboard. My first wife, she grew everything." The door closed behind him. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by dust and shadows, and the ghost of a woman who had grown everything in soil that now grew nothing at all. She looked at the chair pushed against the wall, at the Bible gathering dust on its shelf, and wondered what had happened to the second wife. Clara woke before dawn. The darkness pressed against her like a weight. She lay still on the narrow bed, listening to the creak of the house settling, to the distant lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the barn, to the absolute silence where birdsong should have been, no birds. The land was too dry even for birds. She pushed back the thin blanket and swung her feet to the floor. The boards were cold against her bare soles, rough with splinters that caught at her skin. She dressed quickly in the dark, her fingers finding buttons and laces by memory, and slipped out through the kitchen before the sun had cracked the horizon. The air outside tasted of dust and sage. Clara stood on the porch, watching the sky lighten from black to gray to pale orange along the eastern edge. The single rocking chair sat empty beside her, its wood silvered by years of sun and wind. She didn't sit in it. Instead, she stepped off the porch and walked toward the dead garden. The plots were even more desolate in the early light than they had seemed the night before. Raised beds built from weathered planks, filled with soil so dry it had turned to powder. A few brown stalks, the skeletons of plants that had once been something, tomatoes maybe, or beans poked up at odd angles like grave markers in a forgotten cemetery. Clara crouched beside the nearest bed. She scooped up a handful of dirt and let it sift through her fingers. Fine as flour, dead as ash, but not hopeless. Please, Lord, not hopeless. Her father had been a farmer before the drink took him, before her mother had packed their things and fled to the mills of Massachusetts, where at least the poverty came with a roof and regular wages. Clara remembered bits and pieces, the smell of turned earth in spring, the satisfaction of seeds pushing through dark soil. Her father's voice rough with rare pride as he showed her how to read the land. Dark soil means water, Clara girl, he'd said once, pointing to a patch near the creek bed. Plants know, roots know. You just got to look where they're looking. Clara stood. She wiped her hands on her skirt and began to walk. The property stretched farther than she'd realized, past the barn where Wyatt slept, past the empty corral with its fence posts leaning like tired old men, past a small shed that looked ready to collapse in the next strong wind. She walked with her eyes on the ground, scanning for any variation in color, any hint that moisture might be hiding beneath the cracked surface. Nothing. 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 The sun climbed higher. Sweat prickled along her hairline, gathered in the hollow of her throat, soaked into the collar of her dress. Her mouth grew dry. Her boots raised small clouds of dust with every step. And still she walked, praying silently with each footfall. Then she saw the tree. An old oak, massive and gnarled, standing alone near the western edge of the property. Its leaves were sparse, but green impossibly, defiantly green in this landscape of brown and gray. The trunk was thick enough that 3 men holding hands couldn't have circled it. Its roots spread out like fingers gripping the earth, refusing to let go. Clara's pace quickened. She reached the oak and dropped to her knees beside its roots. The ground here was different. Not wet, not exactly, but darker, denser. When she pressed her palm flat against the soil, she felt something she hadn't felt anywhere else on this land. Coolness. Her heart kicked against her ribs like a mule in a stall. She scrambled to her feet and ran back toward the barn, her boots pounding against the hard earth, her breath coming fast and sharp in the morning air. The shed, she'd seen tools in the shed yesterday, rusted but usable, abandoned like everything else on this dying farm. The shed door groaned on its hinges, the sound like a cat with its tail caught. Inside, she found what she needed, a shovel with a cracked handle, its blade dulled by years of neglect, but still intact. She grabbed it and ran back to the oak, her shadow stretching long behind her. The first strike of metal against earth sent a jolt up her arms. The ground was harder than she'd expected, packed tight by years of drought. Stubborn as an old mule, resistant to any intrusion. Clara adjusted her grip on the worn handle, planted her feet wide, and drove the blade down again, and again, and again. Sweat soaked through the back of her dress, turning the brown calico dark between her shoulder blades. Blisters formed on her palms, hot and tight, threatening to burst with every swing. Her shoulders burned like she'd been carrying buckets of hot coals. Her lower back screamed for mercy. But she kept digging, widening the hole inch by stubborn inch, going deeper into the earth that seemed determined to keep its secrets. 1 foot down, then 2. A meadowlark called somewhere in the distance, the first bird she'd heard since arriving. Clara paused, chest heaving, and listened to its song. A good omen. Her mother would have said, a sign that something was about to change. The soil began to change too, darker now, clumping together instead of crumbling to powder. Clara's arms shook with exhaustion, her muscles trembling like leaves in a storm. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Something was down there. She could feel it the way her father had taught her to feel it. That instinct for water that lived in the bones of anyone who'd ever worked the land and loved it. 3 feet down. The shovel struck something soft. Clara froze. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the hole, ignoring the dirt that smeared across her dress, and reached down with bare hands. Her fingers sank into mud, actual mud, wet and cold and wonderfully, impossibly alive. "Thank you. Lord, thank you." She dug with her hands now, scooping out handfuls of dark earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps that tore at her throat. The hole deepened. The mud grew wetter, and then water. It seeped up through the bottom of the hole, slow and steady as a heartbeat, pooling around her fingers like a secret finally willing to be told. Clara sat back on her heels and stared at it. Her hands were black with mud. Her dress was ruined beyond any hope of washing clean. Her whole body trembled with exhaustion that went bone deep. But there was water. She didn't know how long she sat there. Long enough for the pool to widen, for the water to rise an inch, then 2. Long enough for the sun to climb to its midday position, beating down on her unprotected head with all the mercy of a blacksmith's forge. Long enough for the shadow to fall across her before she realized she was no longer alone. Clara looked up. Wyatt stood at the edge of the hole, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. The sun was behind him, turning him into a dark silhouette against the bright sky. In his hand, he held a tin cup, the same battered cup from yesterday. Steam rising from its contents like a prayer going up to heaven. He didn't speak, just stared at the water seeping up from the earth, at Clara's mud-caked hands, at the hole she'd dug with nothing but a broken shovel and sheer stubbornness, and maybe a little bit of faith. "You found it," he said finally. His voice sounded strange, thick, like there was something caught in his throat that he couldn't quite swallow. Clara looked at her hands. The blisters had burst on both palms, leaving raw red patches that stung where the mud had worked its way in. Dirt was caked under her fingernails, ground into the lines of her skin like it meant to stay forever. "It was here the whole time," she said. Wyatt set the cup down on the grass beside the hole. He lowered himself to his knees, moving slow and careful, like a man approaching something he wasn't sure was real, and reached out to touch the water with his fingertips. His hand trembled just slightly, just enough for Clara to notice in the way the water rippled when his fingers broke the surface. 2 years, he said quietly. His voice had gone rough as sandpaper, raw as Clara's hands. 2 years I've been hauling water from town. 2 years watching this land dry up and blow away. And you—" He stopped, pulled his hand back. Water dripped from his fingers, catching the sunlight like tiny diamonds falling back to earth. "You did good," he said. 3 words, spoken without looking at her, without any particular warmth or feeling. But Clara heard what lived beneath them, the surprise he couldn't quite hide. The grudging respect he hadn't meant to show. The faintest crack in that wall of silence he'd built around himself brick by careful brick. She reached for the tin cup. The coffee was still hot, strong enough to make her eyes water, bitter enough to cut through the dust coating her throat. They sat together at the edge of the hole, watching the water rise, and neither of them spoke. But the silence felt different now. Less empty. Less like the silence between strangers, and more like the silence between two people who'd just discovered they might have something to say to each other after all. Clara drank her coffee and looked at the oak tree with its impossible green leaves spreading against the endless blue sky, and wondered what else this land had been hiding all along. 2 weeks passed, each day bleeding into the next like watercolors left out in the rain. Clara learned the rhythm of the land, the way the sun climbed fast and hard in the morning, the way the wind picked up every afternoon around 3 o'clock, rattling the windows and sending dust devils spinning across the yard. She learned the way the silence at night pressed against her ears like cotton wool, broken only by coyotes singing to the moon and the occasional hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness. She learned the rhythm of Wyatt, too, though that was harder. He rose before dawn and worked until dark, spoke in sentences no longer than 5 or 6 words, and kept that careful distance between them, like a fence neither of them had agreed to build, but both seemed afraid to tear down. But something had shifted since the well. Small things. A nod across the breakfast table when she set his coffee down. The way he'd started leaving the pot warming on the stove when he knew she'd be coming in from the garden. The second chair pulled out from the wall now, positioned at the table as if someone might actually use it. Clara used it. The morning she decided to go to town. The sky was the color of bleached bone, pale and bright, and promising nothing but heat. She'd counted her remaining coins 3 times the night before, hunched over the kitchen table by lamplight 47 cents. Enough for seeds if she was careful. If the prices hadn't climbed since the last time she'd darkened the door of a general store. She found Wyatt in the barn, mending a harness with hands that moved with the slow precision of a man who'd done this particular task 1,000 times before. "I need to go to Bitter Creek," she said. He didn't look up from the leather strap in his hands. "What for?" "Seeds." The single word hung in the air between them like smoke from a chimney on a still day. Wyatt's hands stopped moving. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the harness like it held some answer he couldn't quite decipher. Some riddle he'd been trying to solve for years. "Take the wagon," he said finally. "Mare knows the way better than you do." Clara hesitated in the doorway, her hand resting on the rough wood frame. "You're not coming. Got work here." She waited for more, but nothing came. Just the creak of leather as he returned to his mending. The dismissal as clear as if he'd spoken it aloud. The barn smelled of hay and horse sweat and old leather. Familiar smells that reminded her of her father's hands before the drink had ruined everything. Fine. She could do this alone. She'd been doing things alone her whole life. The ride to town took nearly an hour. The mare was old and slow, picking her way along the rutted track with the careful patience of an animal who had long since stopped hurrying for anyone or anything. Clara let her set the pace, watching the prairie scroll past on either side, brown and gold and endless, broken only by the occasional cluster of sage or the distant silhouette of a hawk circling lazy and patient overhead. "Lord, let this work," she prayed silently, her hands loose on the reins. "Let something grow." Bitter Creek looked smaller in daylight than it had on the evening of her arrival. Meaner somehow, more exposed, like a secret that had been dragged out into the open against its will. The buildings huddled together like survivors of some disaster, their paint peeling, their windows filmed with dust and neglect. A dog slept in the shade of the general store porch. twitching in its dreams. It didn't lift its head as Clara climbed down from the wagon, her boots raising small puffs of dust. The bell above the door jangled as she stepped inside, a cheerful sound completely at odds with the dim interior. The store smelled of coffee beans and lamp oil and something else, something musty and old that clung to the bolts of fabric stacked along the far wall like memories refusing to fade. Clara paused to let her eyes adjust to the dimness, taking in the cluttered shelves and the brass scale gleaming on the counter and the jars of penny candy lined up like soldiers waiting for inspection. A woman stood behind the counter, arranging cans on a shelf with the focused attention of someone who had nothing better to do. Middle-aged, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same unforgiving landscape outside. She turned at Clara's approach, and her eyes sharp as tacks. Missing nothing traveled from Clara's faded bonnet to her mud-stained boots. "Help you? I'm looking for seeds," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "Vegetable seeds, tomatoes, beans, squash if you have it." The woman's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, barely enough to notice if you weren't watching for it. "Well, you're the new one. Aren't you Wyatt Hollis's girl?" Clara felt her spine stiffen like a poker left in the fire. "I'm his wife." "Not yet. You're not proper-like. Anyway." The woman's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Not quite a smirk. Something in between that Clara couldn't read. "I'm Edna Brennan. I run this store. Run most things around here, truth be told, and I've seen 2 others come through here before you, both of them thinking they could make something of that dead patch of dirt Wyatt calls a farm." She reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small wooden box with a grunt of effort. Inside, Clara could see packets of seeds arranged in neat rows, their paper envelopes yellowed with age but still intact. "First one lasted 6 months," Mrs. Brennan continued, setting the box on the counter between them with a solid thunk. "Pretty thing. All blonde curls and big dreams and not a lick of sense. Ran off with a drummer who came through selling patent medicines and promises. Left Wyatt a note pinned to the kitchen table. Didn't even have the decency to say goodbye to his face." Clara's fingers found the seed packets, moving through them with practiced ease. Tomatoes, 5 cents. Beans, 5 cents. Squash, 5 cents. She counted silently, calculating how much she could afford to buy. Second one stayed longer, almost a year. Mrs. Brennan leaned her elbows on the counter, settling in like she planned to be there a while. Her eyes never left Clara's face. Quiet woman. Didn't talk much. Kept to herself. Mostly. One morning Wyatt woke up and she was just gone. Poof. Like smoke in a strong wind. Took the horse and whatever cash she could find and headed east. Never heard from her again. Not a word. Not a letter. Nothing. 15 cents for 3 packets. That would leave her 32 cents for emergencies. For the unexpected things that always seemed to crop up when you could least afford them. Clara gathered the seeds and placed them on the counter, her hand steady despite the churning in her stomach. "I'll take these." Mrs. Brennan didn't move to ring up the purchase. She was still watching Clara with those sharp eyes, studying her like she was trying to read fine print in poor light. "You know what both those women had in common, honey?" Clara met her gaze and held it. "I reckon you're going to tell me whether I want to hear it or not." A surprised laugh burst from Mrs. Brennan's throat, short, sharp, genuine. "Land sakes, you've got a mouth on you. I like that." She shook her head, still chuckling. They were both looking for something Wyatt couldn't give them. Romance, maybe, or excitement, or just someone who'd talk to them and make them feel like they mattered more than the cattle and the crops. That man's got a wall around his heart 10 feet high and made of solid stone. Built it himself, brick by careful brick, every time someone walked away from him. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. You think you're going to be the one to tear it down. Clara counted out 15 cents and placed the coins on the counter. One by one. The copper pennies were worn smooth from years of handling, warm from her pocket. I'm not here to tear anything down, she said quietly. I'm here to grow something. Mrs. Brennan stared at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed again, a real laugh this time, full-bodied and warm. Well, bless your heart, she said, scooping up the coins with practiced fingers. That's the first sensible thing any of Wyatt's women has ever said to me. Maybe you've got more sense than the others after all. She wrapped the seed packets in brown paper, her movements quick and efficient, and handed them across the counter. Her expression had softened slightly, though those sharp eyes remained as watchful as ever. Soil's dead. 2 years without water. Baking in this sun. Nothing's grown on that land since his first wife planted her last crop. I found water, Clara said, tucking the package into her pocket. Under the old oak tree. Dug it out last week with my own 2 hands. Mrs. Brennan's hands stopped moving, frozen mid-reach for a jar of penny candy. You found what now? A spring, underground, been there all along. Just needed someone stubborn enough to go looking for it. For the first time since Clara had entered the store. Mrs. Brennan looked genuinely surprised. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She leaned back, arms crossing over her chest, studying Clara with new interest like she was seeing her clearly for the first time. Well, I'll be switched, she murmured, shaking her head slowly. You actually dug for water on that God-forsaken piece of land. With your own hands, in this heat. I did. And you found it. I did. Mrs. Brennan was quiet for a moment, chewing on her lower lip like she was working through a particularly difficult sum. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out another seed packet tomatoes. Clara saw a different variety than the ones she'd chosen, and set it on top of Clara's wrapped bundle. On the house, she said gruffly. Consider it a welcome gift, or a peace offering, or just an old woman's curiosity about whether you'll prove me wrong. Clara picked up the extra packet, her throat suddenly tight. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet, honey. Mrs. Brennan's voice had gone serious again, all traces of warmth carefully tucked away. You got a long road ahead of you, and Wyatt Hollis isn't an easy man to know. Easier to love a stone than to love that man, some would say. Clara tucked the seeds safely into her pocket, feeling their slight weight against her hip like a promise. I'm not looking for easy. No, I don't suppose you are. Mrs. Brennan walked her to the door, the floorboards creaking under their feet. One more thing. Honey, just between us girls. Clara turned on the threshold, hand on the door frame. The older woman's face had gone serious, all traces of amusement vanishing like morning dew. You asked about the second wife, the one who left without a word. Clara waited, barely breathing. She didn't leave because of the loneliness or the hard work, or even because Wyatt wouldn't talk to her or treat her like anything more than hired help. Mrs. Brennan paused, seeming to weigh her next words like gold on a scale. She left because she found something, in the barn, some letters, I think, or maybe a photograph, something from the first wife, something Wyatt had been keeping hidden away like a secret he couldn't bear to let go of. Whatever it was. She was gone the next morning. Didn't tell anyone what she'd found. Just packed her things and disappeared. The bell above the door jangled as a gust of wind pushed it open an inch. Clara felt the dry air against her face, smelled the dust and sage of the prairie. What kind of letters? Mrs. Brennan shrugged, but her eyes were watchful, measuring, nobody knows. She never told a soul what she read, just packed up and left like the devil himself was chasing her. Clara stepped out into the harsh afternoon sunlight. The dog was still sleeping on the porch, undisturbed by the world. The wagon waited where she'd left it, the old mare standing patiently with her head drooped low, tail flicking at flies. She climbed up onto the seat and unwrapped the seed packets, staring at them without really seeing the faded printing on the paper. Letters in the barn, a photograph, maybe something so disturbing that a woman who'd survived almost a year on that hard land, who'd endured the loneliness and the silence and the slow wearing down of hope, had fled without so much as a word of explanation. Clara gathered the reins and clicked her tongue at the mare, feeling the wagon lurch into motion beneath her. She had seeds to plant, a garden to build, a future to fight for. But first, she thought, as the wagon rattled down the dusty track toward home, first she needed to know what was hiding in that barn. 5 weeks since the seeds went into the ground, Clara crouched at the edge of the garden plot, watching the first pale shoots push through the dark soil like tiny green fingers reaching for the sun. The tomato seedlings were strongest 3 inches tall already, their leaves unfurling with a determination that made her chest tight. The beans had sprouted in neat rows, soldiers standing at attention, and the squash was just beginning to show. Fat little stems shouldering aside the dirt that had tried so hard to hold them down. She touched one of the tomato leaves with her fingertip, soft as a baby's cheek, alive. Behind her, the screen door creaked on its rusty hinges. Clara didn't turn around. She'd learned to recognize Wyatt's footsteps by now, heavy, deliberate, always stopping just short of wherever she happened to be, as if some invisible line existed between them that he couldn't quite bring himself to cross, no matter how much that line had blurred over the past weeks. "Coming along," he said. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, feeling the familiar roughness of the cloth against her palms. "They need more water. The spring's slowing down some." Wyatt moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell the hay and horse sweat that clung to his clothes like a second skin. He studied the garden with that unreadable expression she'd grown accustomed to, his eyes moving from row to row like a man taking inventory of his worldly goods. "I can haul more from the creek," he said. "There's a spot about 3 miles east that still runs this time of year." 3 miles is a long way. Done it before. Clara glanced at him. His profile was sharp against the morning sky-strong jaw, sun-weathered skin, that permanent furrow between his brows that seemed carved there by years of squinting into bright prairie light and worrying about things he couldn't control. "I could come with you," she said. "Help carry." His jaw tightened, almost imperceptible. But she caught it now. After all these weeks of watching and waiting and learning to read the silences between his words. "No need. Wyatt," I said, "no need." He turned and walked back toward the barn, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust with each step. Clara watched him go. that familiar frustration building in her chest like steam in a kettle. 7 weeks on this farm. And he still treated her like a guest who might pack up and leave at any moment. Still kept that wall between them. Brick by careful brick. But something had changed. She'd noticed it first at dinner 3 nights ago. She'd been telling him about her childhood in Massachusetts. Not the hard parts. Not the nights her father came home stinking of whiskey and rage. Just the small memories that surfaced sometimes like bubbles in a slow creek. The way her mother used to sing old hymns while hanging laundry on the line behind their tenement building. The taste of wild blueberries picked from the bushes that grew along the railroad tracks, sweet and warm from the summer sun. Wyatt hadn't responded, hadn't even looked up from his plate, his fork moving mechanically from plate to mouth. But he'd stopped chewing. His whole body had gone still. Leaning slightly forward like a man straining to hear distant music. When she'd finished, he'd nodded once and returned to his meal without comment. But something in the air between them had shifted like wind changing direction before a storm. It wasn't much, but it was something. Clara turned back to the garden. The sun was climbing higher now, the air thickening with heat that pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy hand. She should check the spring. See how much water had collected overnight. Should weed the rows. Stake the tomato plants before they got too tall. Cover the tender shoots against the afternoon wind that always came howling across the prairie around 3 o'clock. But her mind kept drifting back to what Mrs. Brennan had told her in the general store. The old woman's words circling like buzzards over a carcass, letters in the barn, something the second wife found. She'd thought about searching for them, every night for the past 3 weeks, lying awake on her narrow bed, listening to the coyotes sing their lonesome songs. She'd thought about slipping out to the barn and looking through Wyatt's things, finding whatever secret had driven that other woman to flee into the darkness without a backward glance. She hadn't done it. Not because she wasn't curious, Lord knew she was, the wondering eating at her like rust on iron, but because searching through a man's private belongings felt like a betrayal of something sacred. And Clara knew something about betrayal, knew how it felt to have someone go through your things, take what wasn't theirs, leave you feeling exposed and violated and small as a child caught in a lie. If Wyatt had secrets, they were his to share when he was ready. Or not. She just wished he'd trust her enough to choose. The first drops hit her face just after noon. Clara looked up, startled, her hands still buried in the soil around a tomato plant. The sky had gone dark without her noticing thick clouds rolling in from the west like a herd of gray cattle. Heavy and low and swollen with moisture. Wind gusted across the garden, bending the young plants sideways, tearing at her bonnet strings. And then the rain came down. Not a gentle shower, not the light mist she remembered from Massachusetts springs. A downpour, a deluge, like someone had tipped over a bucket the size of the whole sky. Clara scrambled to her feet, her dress already soaked through and clinging to her legs. The seedlings she needed to cover the seedlings before they drowned or got beaten into the mud. She'd left the burlap sacks in the shed, 30 yards away across ground that was already turning to slick brown muck. She ran for them, slipping in the mud that was forming faster than seemed possible, her boots sliding out from under her with every third step. Her arms windmilled for balance. Her breath came in sharp gasps that the rain filled with water. She went down hard. Her hands hit the ground first, sinking into mud up to her wrists, then her knees, then her hip, cold, wet earth soaking through her dress and petticoats until she couldn't tell where she ended and the ground began. Mud splattered up her arms, into her face, across the front of her dress that she'd scrubbed clean just yesterday. Lord, give me strength. She pushed herself up and kept running. The shed door stuck. She yanked at it, once, twice, her fingers slipping on the wet wood, nails scraping against grain that seemed determined to hold fast. On the third pull, it flew open, crashing against the inside wall hard enough to rattle the rusted tools hanging there. Clara grabbed the burlap sacks, 3 of them, barely enough, and ran back out into the storm. The garden was in chaos. Water streamed down the rows, pooling in the low spots, carving tiny rivers through the soil she'd worked so hard to prepare. The tomato plants bent nearly double under the assault, their tender stems threatening to snap. Clara threw herself down beside the first one and draped burlap over it, pressing the edges deep into the mud to hold it in place. Clara, Wyatt's voice, nearly lost in the roar of the rain. She looked up, blinking water from her eyes. He was running toward her from the barn, his hat gone, his dark hair plastered flat to his skull like paint on a fence. He dropped to his knees beside her, mud splattering across his already soaked shirt, and grabbed one of the burlap sacks. "I'll take this row," he shouted over the din. "You get the beans." They worked without speaking, moving down the rows on their hands and knees like penitents crawling toward an altar. The rain hammered down on Clara's back, ran into her eyes and ears and mouth, soaked through every layer of clothing until she couldn't remember what it felt like to be dry and warm. Her fingers were numb. Her knees ached where they'd been grinding into the muddy ground, and she could feel bruises forming with every movement. But she kept going, kept covering, kept fighting to save what they'd built together from seeds and water and stubborn hope. When the last plant was protected, she sat back on her heels and looked at Wyatt. He was kneeling in the mud 3 feet away, rain streaming down his face like tears, like baptism, like something washing clean. His shirt had gone transparent with water, clinging to his shoulders and chest in ways that made Clara suddenly aware of how close they were. His hands hung at his sides, caked with mud to the wrists. And he was looking at her, not past her, not through her like she was made of glass and air, at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Something raw, something unguarded, something stripped bare by the storm the way lightning strips bark from a tree. Clara's breath caught in her throat like a bone. "You're soaking wet," he said. His voice was different, rougher, like gravel rolling in a creek bed. "So are you." Neither of them moved. The rain continued to fall, but softer now. The worst of the storm already passing over them like a train heading east. Clara could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, could feel the cold water running down her back and the mud seeping through her dress, could feel something else, something warm despite the cold, something terrifying spreading through her chest like sunrise. Wyatt's hand moved. He reached toward her face, slowly, like he was approaching a wild bird that might take flight at any sudden movement. His fingers touched her cheek just barely, just enough to brush away a strand of wet hair that had plastered itself to her skin like it meant to stay. Clara held absolutely still, barely breathed. "You stayed," he said quietly. The words seemed to cost him something precious, drawn up from somewhere deep like water from a well. "The storm came, and you stayed out here in the mud And the rain. Of course I stayed. The plants. That's not what I mean. She knew what he meant. 8 weeks now. 8 weeks of hard work and silence and that endless distance between them. 8 weeks of waiting for her to pack her bags and leave like the others, to prove that his wall had been built for good reason. I told you, Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm not going anywhere. Wyatt's hand was still on her face, his thumb moving now, tracing the line of her cheekbone like he was memorizing the shape of it. His eyes were fixed on hers. Searching for something doubt, maybe deception. Whatever it was he'd learned to expect from the women who'd come before her and left him standing alone. Clara didn't look away. Come inside, he said finally, his voice rough as unplaned wood. You'll catch your death out here. He stood and offered her his hand. Clara took it. His grip was strong, his palm rough with calluses that matched her own. And when he pulled her to her feet, he didn't let go immediately. They stood there in the rain. Hands clasped, the garden stretched out around them like a promise half kept. Then Wyatt did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. It was a small sound at first, barely more than a breath rusty as an old gate hinge that hadn't been oiled in years. But it was a laugh, genuine and surprised. And Clara felt something crack open in her chest at the sound of it, something that had been locked up tight without her knowing. What? She asked. Wyatt shook his head. Water dripped from the ends of his hair, ran down the planes of his face. Nothing. Just you've got mud on your nose. Looks like you tried to plant yourself along with the tomatoes. Clara touched her face. Her fingers came away brown, thick with clay. So do you. Looks like a hog's been rooting in your hair. He looked at his hand, still holding hers, looked at the mud caked under his fingernails, ground into every line of his palm. Reckon I do it that. They walked back to the house together, leaving muddy footprints across the porch like a trail of evidence. Inside. Wyatt went to the stove and started building a fire, while Clara found towels, flour sacks. Really, thin and rough, but blessedly dry. She handed one to him. Their fingers touched. Neither of them pulled away. Wyatt, Clara said. She didn't know what she was going to say next. Didn't know what question she wanted to ask, or what truth she was reaching for. She only knew that something had changed between them out there in the rain, working side by side to save something they'd built together, something that mattered. He looked at her, waiting. The women before me, she said slowly, picking her words like she was picking her way across a creek on slippery stones. The ones who left, what happened to them? Really. His face closed. Not all the way, not the complete shutdown she'd seen in those first weeks, but enough. The wall going back up. Brick by careful brick. Mortar still wet between the stones. They left, he said flatly. That's what happened. But why Mrs. Brennan said the second one found something. In the barn, letters, maybe, or... Wyatt's hand tightened on the flour sack towel. His knuckles went white. Mrs. Brennan talks too much. Always has. Wyatt, leave it alone, Clara. He turned away from her, toward the stove where the fire was just catching. Small flames licking at the kindling. His shoulders were rigid. His back, a wall of its own, as solid and unyielding as the one around his heart. Clara stood in the middle of the kitchen, the wet flour sack hanging forgotten from her hand, and watched him retreat into that familiar silence, like a turtle pulling into its shell. The rain had stopped, through the window. She could see the clouds breaking apart, sunlight beginning to spill through the gaps like golden honey. The air smelled clean and fresh. Scrubbed new by the storm, that particular rain smell she remembered from childhood, the one her mother had always loved. She thought about what Mrs. Brennan had said, about letters, about secrets, about a woman who'd found something so disturbing she'd fled without explanation or farewell. She thought about the barn, standing dark and quiet 50 yards from the house, its boards weathered gray by years of sun and wind and secrets kept too long. And she thought about Wyatt's face when he'd touched her cheek in the rain, that raw, unguarded look, like a man who wanted desperately to trust, but had forgotten how to let himself try. "I'm not going to leave," she said quietly, to his back. "Whatever it is you're hiding, I'm not going to leave." Wyatt didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders drop, just slightly, just enough. "I know," he said. His voice was rough, broken at the edges like bread torn by hand instead of sliced. "That's what scares me." Clara set down the towel and walked to where he stood by the stove, close enough to feel the heat beginning to radiate from the iron. She didn't touch him, wasn't sure that would be welcome, but she stood near enough that he could feel her presence, solid and not going anywhere, not going. "You don't have to tell me tonight," she said gently. "You don't have to tell me ever, if you don't want to. But whatever happened with them, it's not going to happen with me." Wyatt was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled and popped as it grew stronger. Outside, a bird sang, the first bird Clara had heard since arriving on this dry, hard land. "It might," he said finally. "It won't." He turned to face her then. His eyes were dark in the dim kitchen, troubled, full of something she couldn't name but wanted desperately to understand. "You don't know that." "No," Clara admitted. "I don't, but I'm choosing to believe it anyway. That's what faith is. Isn't it? Choosing to believe when you can't see the proof." Wyatt studied her face for a long moment. Searching. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it, because some of the tension drained from his shoulders like water from a cracked bucket. "You're stubborn as a mule," he said. "So I've been told." That almost laugh again. That rusty, disused sound that made Clara want to keep talking just to hear it one more time. "Get some dry clothes on," he said. "I'll make coffee." Clara nodded and turned toward the bedroom. She was almost to the faded curtain when his voice stopped her cold. "Clara." She looked back. Wyatt was standing by the stove, the firelight casting dancing shadows across his face. He looked older in that light. The lines deeper, the weariness more visible. But he also looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, gathering his courage to jump. "Thank you," he said, "for staying, for the garden, for—" He stopped, shook his head like he was trying to shake loose words that wouldn't come. "Just thank you," Clara smiled, feeling the warmth of it spreading through her chest. "You're welcome." But she went to change her clothes, leaving him alone in the kitchen with the growing fire and the cooling coffee pot and whatever secrets he was still carrying on those broad, weary shoulders. But as she pulled on dry things, her mind kept circling back to one question, round and round like a hawk, riding the thermals. What was in that barn, and why was Wyatt so afraid for her to find out? 3 weeks without rain. Clara stood at the edge of the garden, watching the tomato leaves curl inward like fists clenching against pain. The soil had cracked again, deep fissures, running between the rows like veins on the back of an old man's hand. The dark earth she'd worked so hard to nurture, turning gray and powdery at the surface. The bean plants drooped, despite the burlap shade she'd rigged over them with sticks and prayer. The squash vines had stopped spreading, their leaves going yellow at the edges like paper held too close to a flame. The spring under the oak tree had slowed to a trickle. She'd checked it this morning before dawn, kneeling in the dirt with her hands cupped beneath the seep like she was begging for alms. What had once been a steady flow enough to fill a bucket in 10 minutes now produced barely a cupful in an hour. The underground water table was dropping, retreating deeper into the earth as the drought tightened its grip on the land like a miser clutching coins. Lord, please, don't let it all be for nothing. The sun beat down on Clara's shoulders, hot and merciless as a blacksmith's forge. Sweat trickled between her shoulder blades, soaking into the already damp fabric of her dress. Her lips were cracked and bleeding at the corners. Her throat felt like she'd been swallowing sand. And the garden she'd poured 10 weeks of her life into. Every ounce of hope she had left was dying right in front of her eyes, and there wasn't a blessed thing she could do to stop it. She heard Wyatt's boots on the porch behind her. "Spring's almost dry," she said without turning around. Her voice came out rough, scraped raw by dust and desperation. "Another week like this, and there won't be anything left to save." He came to stand beside her. She could feel the heat radiating off his body, could smell the dust and sweat that clung to him after a morning of working with the cattle in the relentless sun. "I know. We need to do something. Clara, I'm not giving up." She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him take a half step back, his boots scraping against the dry ground. "I didn't come all the way out here to watch everything die. There has to be another source of water somewhere, a creek, a pond, something we haven't found yet." Wyatt's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath the weathered skin. That familiar tension crept back into his shoulders, pulling them up toward his ears. "There's nothing. I've been on this land 12 years come September. If there was water to be found, I'd have found it by now. Then we haul it, from town, from the creek you mentioned, from wherever we have to go to get it. I don't care if it takes all day and all night. I'm not letting this garden die." "It's just vegetables, Clara!" The words hit her like a slap across the face. She stared at him. Just vegetables, as if the past 10 weeks meant nothing at all, as if the hours she'd spent on her hands and knees in this dirt, digging and planting and watering and weeding until her back screamed and her fingers bled, were worthless, as if the life she'd coaxed from this dead soil was just vegetables. "It's not just vegetables," she said. Her voice came out low and tight, controlled the way you control a horse that wants to bolt. "It's proof that something can grow here, proof that this land isn't dead and buried, proof that I—" She stopped herself, swallowed hard against the lump rising in her throat. Wyatt was watching her with that unreadable expression, his eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. "Proof that you— what? Nothing. Never mind. Clara, I said never mind." She turned away from him, back toward the garden where her plants were dying one leaf at a time. Her eyes burned like someone had thrown sand in them, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here, not in front of him, not when he was standing there telling her that everything she'd worked for, everything she'd hoped for, was just vegetables not worth the trouble of saving. "The cattle need that water," Wyatt said quietly from behind her. "If I have to choose between the garden and 10 head of beef that'll see us through the winter, I choose the cattle. That's not open for discussion." Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging half-moons into her palms. I'm not asking you to choose. You are. Though, every bucket of water that goes to those tomatoes is a bucket that doesn't go to the stock tank. Every hour I spend hauling from the creek is an hour I'm not spending on the 100 other things that need doing around here. You can't have it both ways. Then I'll haul it myself. The creek's 3 miles east. You can't. Watch me. She started walking toward the barn, her stride long and purposeful, her boots raising small clouds of dust with every step. Behind her, she heard Wyatt mutter something under his breath, a curse, maybe, or a prayer. She couldn't tell which, and didn't much care. The barn door groaned as she pushed it open, the sound like an old man complaining about his joints. Inside, the air was thick and close, heavy with the smell of hay and horse and old leather baking in the heat. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of light that filtered through the gaps between the boards like golden columns holding up the roof. Clara grabbed the 2 wooden buckets that hung on nails by the door, their handles worn smooth by years of use, and carried them out into the punishing sunlight. Wyatt was standing where she'd left him, his arms crossed over his chest like a barrier. You're being stubborn as a mule. I know it. 3 miles in this heat. Carrying full buckets, you'll collapse before you make it halfway back. Then I'll have to come find you and haul you home instead of water. Maybe so. Clara set the buckets down and wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, feeling the grit of dust against her skin. But I'm going to try anyway. That's all any of us can do. Something shifted in Wyatt's face. That wall she'd grown so accustomed to seeing, the one he built and rebuilt every time she got too close, seemed to waver like heat shimmer rising from baked earth. Not fall, just waver. Clara, he said. His voice was different now, softer, like worn leather instead of new. Why does this matter so much to you? It's just a patch of dirt and some seeds. She looked at him, really looked, taking in the lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. The gray threaded through his dark hair at the temples. The weathered skin that spoke of a life lived hard under this unforgiving sky. Because it's the first thing I've ever grown, she said quietly. In my whole life. I've never made anything that was mine. Never built anything that lasted. Never had anything that I could point to and say, I did that. I worked in factories, lived in boarding houses, ate food other people cooked, and wore clothes other people made, and never had a single thing I could call my own. Her voice cracked like dry earth. She forced herself to continue. Then I came here, and I put seeds in the ground, and something grew, something alive, something real. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. I know it's just vegetables to you. I know it doesn't matter one whit in the grand scheme of things, not compared to cattle and money and staying alive through another winter. But it matters to me. It's the first thing that's ever mattered just to me. And I'm not ready to let it go without a fight. Wyatt was silent for a long moment. The sun beat down on them both, relentless and uncaring as a tax collector. Then he uncrossed his arms. There's a spring, he said slowly, like the words were being pulled from him against his will, behind the eastern ridge, about 1.5 miles from here. It usually dries up come summer, but this year... He paused, shook his head. This year it might still have water. Won't know until we check. Clara's heart lurched in her chest. Why didn't you tell me before? Because I didn't think it would matter. Didn't think... He stopped again, and she saw something flicker across his face like lightning in the distance. Something that looked almost like shame. "Didn't think you'd still be here by now, if I'm being honest." The words hung in the air between them, heavy as the heat. Clara understood then. He'd expected her to leave, same as the others. Expected her to give up, pack her bags, follow the path of the women who'd come before, and found this life too hard, too lonely, too much like slow death by inches. Why share secrets with someone who was already halfway out the door? "I'm still here," she said. "I can see that, and I'm not leaving." Wyatt's jaw worked, the muscle jumping beneath his beard stubble. He looked away, toward the garden, toward the dying plants she refused to abandon. "I know," he said quietly. "That's what I can't figure out. Why you'd stay when everyone else ran." He turned and walked toward the barn without waiting for an answer. Clara watched him go, confused, until he emerged a moment later, carrying 2 more buckets and a length of rope coiled over his shoulder. "Come on," he said, not looking at her. "I'll show you where the spring is, but we'd best hurry, sun'll be down in 6 hours, and we've got a long walk ahead." They walked in silence. The land rolled out around them, brown and gold and endless as eternity itself. Clara's boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. Sweat dripped down her face, stung her eyes, soaked through the back of her dress until it clung to her skin like a second layer. But she kept walking, matching Wyatt's pace step for step, refusing to fall behind or ask for rest. The spring was exactly where he'd said it would be, a narrow cleft in the rock face of a low ridge, water seeping out from somewhere deep underground. It wasn't much. A thin stream, barely enough to wet the rocks beneath it. But it was water, and it was flowing. And Clara dropped to her knees beside it with a sound that was half laugh, half sob, half prayer of thanksgiving. "It's here," she breathed. "Thank the Lord, it's still here." Wyatt stood behind her, his shadow falling across the water like a cooling shade. "Won't last long in this heat, maybe another week or 2 at most before it dries up like everything else. Then we'd better work fast and not waste a drop." She started filling the first bucket. The water was cold against her cracked hands, shockingly. Blessedly cold after the heat of the walk, and so clear she could see every pebble on the bottom of the little pool. Wyatt crouched beside her and began filling the second bucket without being asked. They worked without speaking, filling bucket after bucket. The only sounds were the splash of water, the creak of the wooden handles, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead like a witness to their labor. When all 4 buckets were full, Wyatt threaded the rope through the handles, creating a yoke he could carry across his broad shoulders. "I can take 2, Clara said. "No, Wyatt." I said no. He hoisted the yoke onto his shoulders, the muscles in his arms and back bunching under the strain like ropes pulled tight. "You walk ahead and watch the path. Last thing we need is me stepping in a gopher hole and spilling all this water we just hauled." Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. There was something in his voice, not anger, not dismissal, but something else. Something protective, something that made her chest feel tight in a way she couldn't quite explain but didn't entirely mind. They started back toward the farm. The return journey was slower, the weight of the water forcing Wyatt to move carefully over the uneven ground. Clara walked ahead, kicking stones out of the path, watching for holes that might cause him to stumble and lose their precious cargo. They were halfway home when Wyatt spoke. "My first wife was named Ellen." Clara stopped walking, turned to face him. Wyatt was staring straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his face as blank as a fresh-wiped slate. She was the one who planted the garden, the first one, before it all died. She grew tomatoes and beans and squash, to do. Had a real gift for making things grow. Could stick a twig in the ground and have it blooming come morning, my mother used to say. Clara waited. She barely dared to breathe, afraid that any sound might break whatever spell had loosened his tongue. We were married 3 years. Good years. Mostly. Hard, but good. His jaw tightened. Then she got sick. Some kind of fever that came on fast and wouldn't break no matter what we tried. Doctor came out from town, but there wasn't anything he could do. She died in the bedroom, the same room you sleep in now. The words fell into the silence like stones dropping into still water. Wyatt, I couldn't save her. His voice cracked, a fissure running through stone. Couldn't do a blessed thing but sit there holding her hand and watching her slip away inch by inch. After that, he shook his head slowly. After that, I let the garden die. Let everything die. Didn't seem like there was any point in growing things when they were just going to be taken away from you in the end. Clara's throat ached like she'd swallowed a stone. She wanted to go to him, to touch him, to offer some kind of comfort for a wound that had clearly never healed. But she sensed that any movement might shatter the fragile thread of his confession. The second wife, she said carefully. What happened to her? Wyatt's face went still as a frozen pond. She found Ellen's things. Letters. A photograph. A lock of hair I'd kept in a box. She thought. He stopped. His hands tightened on the rope until his knuckles went white. She thought I was still carrying a torch for a dead woman. Thought she'd never be able to compete with a ghost. Was she right? The question came out before Clara could stop it. She regretted it instantly, saw the way Wyatt's shoulders stiffened, saw the shutters come down over his eyes like windows being closed against a storm. I don't know, he said flatly. She didn't stay long enough for either of us to find out. They walked the rest of the way in silence. When they reached the farm, Wyatt set the buckets down beside the garden and straightened, rolling his shoulders to work out the strain. Clara picked up one of the buckets and started watering the tomato plants, moving down the row with careful, measured pours, giving each plant just enough to drink without wasting a single drop. She was on the third plant when Wyatt's voice came from behind her. Clara! She turned. He was standing at the edge of the garden, silhouetted against the setting sun. His face was in shadow, but she could see the tension in every line of his body. What you said earlier, about proving something. He paused. You don't have to prove anything to me. You know that. Don't you? Clara set down the bucket. I wasn't trying to prove anything to you. Then who? She considered the question. Considered all the years of being told she wasn't enough, not pretty enough, not skilled enough, not worthy of anyone's time or attention or love. Myself, she said quietly. I was trying to prove something to myself. Wyatt nodded slowly. Something in his expression shifted that wall wavering again, cracks appearing in the mortar that held it together. Did it work? Clara looked at the garden, at the drooping plants, the cracked soil, the dying vines she'd fought so hard to save, at the buckets of water they'd carried 1.5 miles through blistering heat. I don't know yet, she admitted. Ask me again when something blooms. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, He stepped forward and picked up one of the remaining buckets. "I'll take the beans," he said. "You finish the tomatoes." They worked side by side until the light faded, watering each plant with the precious water they'd hauled from the spring. Clara's arms ached, her back screamed, her hands were raw from gripping the bucket handles, but Wyatt was beside her. And that mattered more than she'd expected it to. When the last drop of water had been poured, they stood together in the gathering darkness, looking at the garden they'd just fought to save. "Tomorrow," Wyatt said. "We go back to the spring." Clara nodded. "Tomorrow." He turned toward the house, then stopped, looked back at her. "Clara, yes, those letters, Ellen's letters." He swallowed hard enough that she could see his throat working in the dim light. "They're still in the barn, in a wooden box under the loose floorboards near the back wall. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away." Clara's heart contracted in her chest. "You don't have to, I know." He cut her off with a raised hand. "But I want you to know where they are, just in case." He stopped. "In case you want to read them. I won't stop you." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. "Why would I want to read them?" Wyatt's face was unreadable in the darkness, just shadows and angles and the faint gleam of his eyes. Because the second wife did. Margaret was her name, and after she read them, she was gone before sunrise. "I'm not her. I know that." His voice was rough as unplaned wood. "That's why I'm telling you where they are, so you can decide for yourself." He turned and walked toward the house, leaving Clara alone in the garden with the dying plants and the empty buckets and a question she couldn't stop asking herself. What was in those letters that had driven a woman to flee in the middle of the night? And did she have the courage to find out? The first night, Clara's hands bled. She didn't notice until they were halfway back from the spring, the rope handles of the buckets cutting into palms already raw from days of digging and hauling. The pain registered somewhere distant, muffled by exhaustion that had seeped into her bones like water into dry earth. She kept walking, one foot in front of the other, the bucket sloshing against her legs, water splashing onto her boots, soaking through the cracked leather to her skin. Wyatt walked ahead with his own load, 4 buckets balanced on the yoke across his shoulders, his back bent under the weight like an old man's. The moon hung fat and full overhead, bright enough to cast shadows. And Clara followed his dark silhouette along the narrow path they'd worn into the prairie grass over the past week. 1.5 miles. 20 trips. That was what they'd calculated the minimum needed to keep the garden alive until rain came. If rain came. Lord, let it rain. Please. Clara's foot caught on a rock hidden in the darkness. She went down hard. The buckets flew from her grip, spinning through the air, water arcing silver in the moonlight, before splashing across the dry earth and disappearing into the cracks like it had never existed. Her knees hit the ground first, then her palms, and the pain that had been muffled suddenly roared to life, a fire running up her arms, burning through her wrists, screaming in her shoulders. She looked at her hands in the moonlight. Dark smears covered her palms, blood mixing with dirt, running into the creases of her skin like tiny rivers finding their course. Clara. Wyatt was there, crouching beside her, his face a blur of concern in the silver light. He grabbed her wrists and turned her hands over, and she heard his breath catch in his throat like something had stuck there. "You're bleeding. Why didn't you say something?" "It doesn't matter." "The devil it doesn't." His voice was sharp, angry. But not at her, she could hear the difference now. After all these weeks, angry at the situation, at the drought, at whatever cruel fate had brought them to this moment. "Why didn't you speak up?" Clara tried to pull her hands back. He held on, his grip firm but careful, avoiding the worst of the wounds. "Because the garden needs water," she said, her voice coming out thin and reedy, like wind through cracked boards. "And complaining about blisters doesn't fill any buckets." Wyatt stared at her. The moonlight caught his eyes, dark, troubled, full of something she couldn't name, but felt deep in her chest. "You're not a mule, Clara. You're not some machine that doesn't feel pain." He released one of her wrists and reached for his belt. "You can't just destroy yourself for a few tomato plants." "I'm not destroying myself. Look at your hands." She looked. The blisters had burst hours ago, leaving raw red patches that glistened wetly in the pale light. Dirt was ground into the open wounds, dark against the exposed flesh, like someone had rubbed coal into her skin. Her fingers trembled when she tried to curl them, the muscles refusing to obey. "It's fine," she said. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "It's not fine, not by a long stretch." Wyatt pulled out a knife, the blade catching moonlight, and cut a strip from the bottom of his shirt. The fabric tore with a sound like something giving up. He began wrapping her right hand, his movements quick but gentle, his calloused fingers brushing against her torn skin. Clara watched him work. Her throat felt tight, swollen shut. "You're ruining your shirt," she managed. "I've got other shirts. Only got one of you." He finished the right hand and started on the left. Clara could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin, could smell the sweat and dust, and something else underneath, something warm and human that made her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. "There," he said when both hands were wrapped. "That should hold until we get back." Clara flexed her fingers experimentally. The bandages helped, not much, but enough to grip without screaming. "Thank you." Wyatt nodded. He started to rise, then stopped, his eyes moving to the spilled buckets lying on their sides, the dark stain spreading across the ground where the water had already soaked into the thirsty earth. "We lost 2 loads, he said quietly. Clara's stomach clenched like a fist. 2 loads. That was, she calculated quickly, nearly a quarter of what they'd hauled tonight. Wasted. Gone. Swallowed by the same earth they were trying so desperately to save. Because she'd been too proud to admit she was hurt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words scraped against her throat like sandpaper. "Don't." "But I said don't." He stood and offered her his hand, his face unreadable in the darkness. "Come on. We've got more trips to make before sunrise." They finished the night's hauling in silence. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten from black to purple to pale orange, Clara could barely stand. Her legs shook with every step, threatening to buckle like green wood under too much weight. Her back felt like someone had taken a hammer to her spine. Her bandaged hands throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a constant pulse of pain that matched the pounding in her skull. But the garden had water. Not enough, never enough, but water. They collapsed on the porch as the sun crested the horizon. Clara sat on the top step, her legs stretched out in front of her, her head resting against the rough wooden railing. Wyatt sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say. Just the exhaustion and the silence and the orange light spreading across the dying land like spilled honey. The second night was worse. Clara's hands had stiffened overnight, the muscles seizing up, the wounds crusting over into painful scabs that cracked open the moment she gripped the bucket handles. She rewrapped the bandages herself before they left, adding more strips torn from an old flour sack. But the pain was constant now, a dull fire that flared into agony with every movement. She didn't complain, didn't slow down, just walked and carried and poured, over and over, until her mind went blank and her body moved on instinct alone. Wyatt watched her. She could feel his eyes on her throughout the night, assessing. Worried, angry in that sideways way of his that wasn't really anger at all. He tried to take her buckets twice. She refused. He tried to make her rest while he finished a trip alone. She refused that too. "You're going to kill yourself," he said somewhere around midnight, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I've seen mules work themselves to death. Doesn't happen fast, but it happens sure. Then I'll die doing something useful for once in my life." The words came out harsher than she'd intended. She saw Wyatt flinch, saw something flash across his face hurt. Maybe, or something deeper before he turned away without another word. They didn't speak again until dawn. The third night. Clara broke. She didn't mean to. Had promised herself she wouldn't. Had repeated it like a prayer with every step. I will not break. I will not break. I will not break. But they were on the last trip of the night, the spring barely producing enough water to fill the buckets anymore. And her body simply gave out like a horse that had been ridden too hard for too long. One moment she was walking, putting one foot in front of the other the way she'd done 1,000 times before. The next, her knees buckled. She went down in the middle of the path, the buckets crashing beside her, water soaking into the dust and disappearing forever. She tried to get up. Her arms wouldn't support her weight, trembling and collapsing like they were made of wet paper. She tried again, forcing her palms flat against the ground, pushing with everything she had left. Her vision went black at the edges, narrowed to a tunnel. She felt herself falling sideways, the world tilting like a ship in a storm. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. "Clara, Clara," Wyatt's voice, but far away, like he was shouting from the bottom of a deep well. She felt herself being lifted, cradled against a chest that was hard with muscle and damp with sweat. The world tilted and spun, and she closed her eyes against the dizziness that threatened to pull her under. "I can walk," she mumbled. The words came out slurred, wrong. "No, you can't. The water, forget the water." He was carrying her, actually carrying her like she weighed nothing, like she was a child instead of a grown woman. His boots crunching against the dry grass as he moved. Clara wanted to protest, wanted to insist that she was fine, that she could finish the night's work, that she wasn't some fragile thing that needed rescuing. But her body had surrendered, given up the fight without her permission. She let her head fall against his shoulder, felt his heart pounding beneath her cheek. Steady and strong despite the exhaustion that must be dragging at him too. Smelled the dust and sweat and sage that clung to his clothes like a second skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the fabric of his shirt. "Stop apologizing." "But the garden, I don't care about the garden." His voice cracked on the words like ice breaking on a frozen river. I don't care about the tomatoes or the beans or any of it. I care about—" He stopped. His arms tightened around her. "I care about you," he said quietly. "And I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore. It's tearing me apart." Clara's eyes burned. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she was fine, that she could handle whatever this land threw at her, that she'd survived worse than a few sleepless nights and some blisters. But the words wouldn't come, because she wasn't fine. She knew that now, as surely as she knew her own name. Her body was failing. Her hands were ruined, and all the stubborn determination in the world couldn't change the fact that she'd pushed herself past the breaking point and over the edge. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted. Her voice came out thin, barely audible even to her own ears. "I don't know how to quit fighting. It's all I've ever known how to do." Wyatt's pace slowed. She felt him look down at her, though she couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. "You don't have to stop fighting," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "You just have to let someone fight alongside you." They reached the farmhouse. Wyatt carried her up the porch steps, through the kitchen that still smelled faintly of coffee and bacon grease, and laid her down on the narrow bed in the back room. Clara's muscles screamed in relief as she sank into the thin mattress. "Sleep," Wyatt said. "I'll finish the last trip alone. You can't carry all those buckets by yourself. It'll break your back. Watch me." He turned toward the door. Clara reached out, her bandaged hand catching his wrist before she could think better of it. "Wyatt?" He stopped. Didn't turn. "Stay," she said. The word came out before she could stop it, dragged from somewhere deep inside her. "Please, just stay with me." Silence, the kind that stretched and pulled, filling up all the empty spaces in the room. Then Wyatt turned back. He looked at her, really looked. His eyes moving over her face, her bandaged hands, her exhausted body that had nothing left to give, and something in his expression shifted like clouds moving across the moon. He sat down on the edge of the bed. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll stay." Clara closed her eyes. She felt his weight beside her, felt the warmth of his body close to hers. Her hand was still on his wrist, her fingers resting against his pulse point, and she could feel his heart beating fast. Faster than it should have been. "I'm not going to leave," she murmured. The words felt important, essential, something she needed him to understand before she let the darkness take her. "Whatever happens, whatever you're hiding in that barn, I'm not going to leave." Wyatt's hand moved. His fingers found hers, rough calluses brushing against the edge of her bandages. He held on gently, careful not to hurt her damaged hands, and his grip was warm and steady as a lantern in a storm. "I know," he said. His voice was rough, broken at the edges like bread torn by hand. "That's what terrifies me more than anything." Clara's eyes opened. She looked up at him, at the moonlight filtering through the window and catching the planes of his face, at the fear and hope and something deeper warring in his expression. "Why?" she asked. "Why does it terrify you?" Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, a gentle rhythm that seemed almost unconscious. "Because Ellen stayed, too," he said finally. "She stayed, and she fought, and she worked herself to the bone, trying to make this place into something worth having. And then one day, she got sick. And I couldn't—" His voice broke. He looked away, toward the window, toward the darkness outside. "I couldn't save her. he finished. Couldn't do anything but watch her die in this very room, in this very bed. And afterward I swore I'd never— He stopped, swallowed hard. I swore I'd never let myself care that much about anyone again. Clara's chest ached like something inside had cracked open. She understood now. The wall he'd built, the distance he kept, the way he'd expected her to leave it wasn't coldness. It wasn't indifference. It was armor, protection against the kind of loss that could destroy a man. I'm not Ellen, she said softly. I know. And I'm not the others, the ones who left you behind. I know that too. She pushed herself up on one elbow, ignoring the screaming protest of her exhausted muscles. Wyatt was still looking away, his jaw tight, his shoulders rigid as fence posts. Look at me, she said. He didn't move. Wyatt, look at me. Slowly, reluctantly, like a man being pulled against his will. He turned. His eyes met hers, and Clara saw everything laid bare: the fear, the grief, the desperate hope he'd been fighting against for months, like a man fighting a flood. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever. Do you understand? His hand tightened on hers. His throat worked. Promise me, he said. The words came out rough, scraped raw. I need to hear you promise. I promise. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lowered his forehead to rest against hers. His breath was warm on her face. His eyes closed. Okay, he whispered. Okay. They stayed like that, foreheads touching, hands clasped, breathing the same air, until Clara's exhaustion finally pulled her under. She felt herself drifting, felt Wyatt's grip on her hand steady and sure, felt something settle into place in her chest, like a key turning in a lock. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was his voice. So quiet, she might have imagined it. I care about you too, he said. More than I should, more than I ever meant to. Clara smiled in the darkness and slept when she woke. The sun was high and Wyatt was gone. The space beside her on the bed was cold, and for one terrible moment, she thought. But no, she could hear him outside, hear the sound of buckets clanking and water splashing on dry earth. He hadn't left. He'd just gone back to work. Same as always. Clara sat up slowly, testing her body. Everything ached. Her hands throbbed, but she was alive, and the garden was alive, and Wyatt was still here. She stood and walked to the window. He was in the garden, pouring water over the tomato plants with careful, measured movements. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his back bent with exhaustion, but he kept going, plant by plant, row by row. Clara watched him for a long moment. Then she went to find fresh bandages for her hands. They had more water to haul. The clouds came on a Tuesday. Clara saw them first, a dark smudge on the western horizon, building slowly throughout the morning like a bruise spreading across pale skin. She was in the garden, checking the tomato plants for signs of new growth, when the first cool breeze touched her face like a blessing. She straightened, looked west. The clouds were closer now, heavy and gray, their bottoms flat and dark with the promise of moisture. The wind picked up, carrying a smell she hadn't realized she'd been missing until this very moment, that particular scent of rain coming. Wet earth and sky, and something electric that made her skin prickle. Wyatt. He emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, squinting against the light. His eyes followed her pointing finger to the horizon, and she watched his face change. The exhaustion that had carved itself into his features over the past 2 weeks seemed to lift, replaced by something cautious and fragile. "Could be nothing," he said, crossing the yard to stand beside her. "We've had clouds before that came to nothing." "It's different this time. Can't you smell it? Feel it?" He tilted his head back, nostrils flaring. The wind gusted again, stronger now, bending the tomato plants sideways and tugging at Clara's bonnet strings. "Maybe," he admitted. "Lord willing." They stood together at the edge of the garden, watching the clouds roll closer like a herd of gray cattle coming home. Clara's bandaged hands hung at her sides, still tender but healing day by day. 2 weeks since the long nights of hauling water. 2 weeks of careful rationing, of watching the spring slowly recover, of praying every morning and every night for relief. The first drop hit Clara's cheek. She gasped, reached up to touch the spot, her fingers coming away wet and cool. Another drop. Then another. Then a dozen more, spattering the dry earth around her feet. And then the sky opened up and let loose. The rain came down in sheets, driven sideways by the wind, soaking through Clara's dress in seconds. She didn't move, didn't run for shelter the way good sense said she should. Just stood there with her face turned up to the heavens, letting the water wash over her, feeling it stream down her cheeks and neck and soak into the dusty fabric of her dress like a baptism. Beside her, Wyatt was doing the same. The garden drank greedily, the cracked earth softening and darkening as the water soaked in. Clara watched the puddles form in the furrows between the rows, watched the drooping plants seem to straighten under the downpour, watched the brown giving way to glistening green. She started to laugh. It bubbled up from somewhere deep in her chest, a sound she barely recognized after all these weeks of worry and work and bone-deep exhaustion. She laughed until her sides ached, the rain running into her open mouth, tasting of dust and sky and answered prayers. Wyatt was looking at her. She turned to face him, still laughing, her hair plastered to her skull like dark seaweed, her dress clinging to her body in ways that would have made her blush a month ago. He was soaked through too, water streaming down his face, dripping from the ends of his hair. And he was smiling. Not the almost smile she'd grown accustomed to seeing, not the grudging twitch of lips that passed for amusement in Wyatt Hollis's world. A real smile, wide and genuine and startling, transforming his weathered face into something almost young. "You look like a drowned cat," he said. "So do you. Worse, even." They stared at each other for a heartbeat. Then Clara did something she hadn't planned, hadn't thought about, hadn't given herself permission to do. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm despite the cold rain, strong and steady as the earth beneath their feet. They stood there in the downpour, hands clasped, grinning at each other like a pair of fools while the garden they'd nearly killed themselves to save drank its fill. The rain lasted 3 hours. By the time it stopped, the world had changed. The cracked earth had softened to dark mud. The air smelled clean and new, scrubbed fresh by the storm. And the garden, The garden was alive in a way it hadn't been since Clara had first put seeds in the ground all those weeks ago. She walked through the rows slowly, her boots squelching in the mud, cataloging the damage and the salvation. A few plants had been beaten down by the force of the rain, their stems bent or broken, but most had survived. More than survived, they looked healthier than they had in weeks, their leaves unfurling, their colors deepening from sickly yellow-green to rich emerald. She was examining a tomato plant, pushing aside leaves to check the stem. When she saw it, a flower, small, yellow, perfect as a prayer answered, tucked among the leaves of the largest plant, its petals still beaded with rainwater like tiny diamonds. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She crouched down, bringing her face close to the blossom, hardly daring to believe it was real. But it was solid and alive and unmistakably there, a spot of sunshine against the green. "Wyatt," she called softly, "come here." He came to stand beside her. She pointed at the flower, and she heard his sharp intake of breath. "Well, I'll be," he said quietly. "First one of the season. First one." They knelt together in the mud, side by side, staring at that tiny yellow flower like it was made of pure gold. Clara's throat felt tight. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Wyatt didn't answer right away. When Clara looked at him, his jaw was working, his eyes fixed on the flower with an intensity that made her chest ache. "Ellen grew tomatoes," he said finally. His voice was rough, like gravel under wagon wheels. "Same variety as these. I kept the seeds from her last crop, stored them in a tin in the barn. Never thought—" He stopped, swallowed. "Never thought anyone would plant them again." Clara looked at the flower. Ellen's seeds. Ellen's tomatoes. Growing in a garden that Clara had brought back from the dead with her own 2 hands. "She'd be happy," Clara said quietly. "To see them blooming again after all this time." Wyatt's hand found hers in the mud. His grip was tight, almost painful. "Thank you," he said. The words seemed to cost him something precious, dragged up from somewhere deep. "For not giving up, for staying when anyone else would have run, for—" He shook his head like a horse shaking off flies. "For everything." Clara squeezed his hand back. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." And he turned to face her fully. And she saw it, then the wall completely down. The fortress abandoned. The gates thrown wide open. Just a man, tired and scarred and hopeful in a way he'd clearly forgotten how to be. "I've spent so long pushing people away, expecting them to leave, building up walls so it wouldn't hurt so much when they did." He paused. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "But you didn't leave. You stayed and fought and nearly worked yourself into the grave trying to save a garden I'd given up on years ago." His voice cracked like dry wood. "I don't know how to do this, Clara. Don't know how to let someone in after all this time. But I want to try. With you, if you'll have me." Clara looked at him, really looked, taking in every line and scar and shadow on his weathered face. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the factory floors and boarding houses, the letters from a stranger promising nothing but hard work, the tin cup of coffee on her first day, the water they'd hauled through endless nights, the flower blooming now in the garden they'd saved together. "Yes," she said. "I'll have you." Wyatt's eyes closed. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, gentle, reverent, like she was something precious he was afraid he might break. Then he stood, pulling her up with him. "Come on," he said, his voice rough but warm. "There's something I want to show you." He led her to the barn. Clara had been in here before, had passed through on her way to the tools, the feed, the endless supplies needed to keep a farm running. But Wyatt led her past all of that, to a corner she'd never thought to explore, where a canvas tarp covered something bulky and angular. He pulled the tarp aside with a flourish. Underneath was a rocking chair, not the weathered one on the porch, but a new one, the wood still pale and unfinished, smelling of fresh sawdust and the linseed oil he'd used to smooth the grain. "I've been working on it," Wyatt said, his voice gruff, almost embarrassed. "At night, when I couldn't sleep, and the worry got too loud in my head, figured the porch needed 2 chairs if—" He stopped. "If you were going to stay." Clara stared at the chair, at the careful joinery, the smooth curves of the armrests, the hours of labor and hope that had gone into its creation. "You made this," she said slowly. "For me?" "It's not finished yet. Still needs sanding in places. And the seat isn't quite—" She kissed him. It wasn't planned, wasn't thought through. She just stepped forward, put her hands on his chest, rose up on her toes, and pressed her lips to his. He went still as a startled deer, for one terrible moment. Clara thought she'd made a mistake, that she'd misread everything, that he'd push her away, that the walls would slam back into place and she'd be left standing alone in this dusty barn with nothing but her foolish hopes. Then his arms came around her. He pulled her close, one hand spreading across her back, the other cupping the base of her skull like she was something precious he'd been waiting his whole life to hold. And he kissed her back, tentative at first, almost questioning. Then deeper, more certain, like a man remembering something he'd thought he'd lost forever. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "I've wanted to do that," Wyatt said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Since the day you found the water under that old oak tree." Clara laughed, a sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest. "Why didn't you—" "Scared." He said it simply, without shame or excuse. "Scared you'd leave. Scared I'd feel something and lose it all over again." Clara reached up and touched his face. His skin was rough with stubble, warm beneath her palm. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "How many times do I have to say it before you believe me?" His mouth twitched, probably a few more yet. "Then I'll keep saying it until it sticks." She kissed him again, shorter this time, sweeter, a promise sealed. When she pulled back, her eyes fell on something behind him, half hidden in the shadows of the corner. A wooden box, tucked behind a coil of rope and a stack of old feed sacks. The letters. Ellen's letters. Clara had almost forgotten about them. In the chaos of the drought and the long nights and the desperate fight to save the garden, the mystery of what the second wife had found had faded into the background like old wallpaper, but now it came rushing back. Wyatt followed her gaze. His expression shifted, not closing off entirely, but guarded, wary. "You can read them," he said quietly. "If you want. I meant what I said before." Clara looked at the box, then back at Wyatt. "I don't need to," she said. His eyebrows rose like startled birds. "You don't—" "No." She shook her head slowly. "Whatever's in there, it's your past, your grief. I don't need to go digging through it to understand who you are now. The man who made me coffee on my first day here, who hauled water through 3 nights without sleep, who built a rocking chair because he wanted me to stay. She touched his chest, feeling his heart beating strong beneath her palm. That's the man I care about, not whoever you were before. Wyatt stared at her. Something shifted in his eyes, surprise, gratitude, and something deeper, something that looked like trust finally taking root. The second wife, he said slowly. Margaret. She read the letters, found out things about Ellen, about our marriage, about the hard times we had, things that weren't. He paused, searching for words. We loved each other, Ellen and me, but it wasn't always easy. The letters showed that, the fights, the disappointments, the times we almost gave up on each other. Margaret read all of it and decided I was damaged goods, that I'd never be able to love anyone the way I loved Ellen. Was she right? The question came out before Clara could stop it. She held her breath, waiting. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear. No, he said. She wasn't. Clara's chest expanded like lungs filling with fresh air. She felt something release inside her, some tension she hadn't known she was carrying. Good, she said. Then let's leave the letters where they are. They walked out of the barn together, into the late afternoon light. The sky had cleared, the clouds moving east, and the sun was warm on Clara's face. The garden gleamed with moisture, the plants standing tall and green, that single yellow flower bright among the leaves. Wyatt's hand found hers as naturally as breathing. They stood on the porch, looking out at the land they'd fought so hard to save. The old rocking chair sat empty beside them, weathered and patient. 2 chairs, Wyatt said quietly. I'll bring the new one out tomorrow. Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling his warmth, his solidity, his presence beside her. I'd like that very much. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and pink. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang a sound Clara hadn't heard in months. The drought was over. The garden was alive. And for the first time since she'd arrived on this hard, unforgiving land, Clara felt like she might actually be home. She looked up at Wyatt, at the softness in his eyes, at the way the last of the tension had finally left his shoulders. What happens now? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he smiled that real smile, the one she'd first seen in the rain. Now, he said, we wait for the tomatoes to ripen. Clara laughed and squeezed his hand. But as she watched the sun sink lower, painting the clouds in shades of fire, a small question nagged at the back of her mind like a splinter under the skin. Mrs. Brennan had said the second wife left the morning after she found the letters, fled without explanation, without goodbye, like she'd seen a ghost. But if the letters just contained the ordinary struggles of a marriage, fights and disappointments and hard times, why would that drive someone away in such a hurry? What else was hiding in that box? The tomatoes ripened in late August. Clara stood in the garden at sunset, a wicker basket heavy on her arm, watching the light turn everything to gold. The plants had grown tall and strong over the summer, their vines thick with fruit, deep red globes that hung like Christmas ornaments, warm from the afternoon sun. Beans climbed the wooden stakes Wyatt had driven into the ground, their pods fat and ready for picking. The squash sprawled across the far corner. yellow blossoms giving way to hard-shelled fruit that would keep them fed through the long winter ahead. 4 months. That was all it had taken. 4 months of work and worry and hope. And the dead land had come alive again. Clara picked a tomato and brought it to her nose. The skin was smooth and taut beneath her fingers. The smell earthy and sweet and green all at once. She could feel the weight of it in her palm, solid, real. Proof that something good could grow from barren soil if you loved it enough. "That's a fine one you got there." She turned. Wyatt was walking toward her from the barn. His sleeves rolled to his elbows, dust on his boots from the afternoon's work. The setting sun caught his face, softening the hard lines, bringing out flecks of amber in his dark eyes she'd never noticed before. He looked younger than he had 4 months ago. Or maybe not younger, just lighter. Like some weight he'd been carrying on his shoulders had finally been set down. "They're all fine," Clara said, holding up the tomato for him to see. "Better than fine. Best crop I've ever grown. Only crop you've ever grown." She smiled at the teasing in his voice. "Still counts, doesn't it?" Wyatt came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. He reached into the basket and picked up a tomato, turning it over in his calloused hands like he was examining a gold nugget. "Ellen would have been proud," he said quietly. "She always said these were the best eating tomatoes in all of Wyoming." Clara looked at him. He'd been talking about Ellen more these past few weeks, small memories, little stories, the kind of ordinary details that made up a shared life. Not with the sharp grief she'd sensed in those early days, but with something gentler now. Acceptance, maybe, or gratitude for what had been. "Tell me about her," Clara said. "What was she like?" Wyatt's thumb traced the smooth skin of the tomato. "She was stubborn. Stubborn as a mule in mud. My mother used to say. Once she got an idea fixed in her head, there was no talking her out of it, no matter how foolish it seemed." "Sounds familiar." He glanced at her, his mouth twitching. "Reckon that's why He stopped himself. "Why you what? Nothing important." Clara set down the basket and turned to face him fully. The light was fading now, the sky deepening from orange to purple at the edges, the first stars beginning to show themselves. "Why you what?" she asked again, softer this time. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, the same hand that had blistered and bled hauling water through those long summer nights. Now healed, but still marked with faint scars she'd carry forever. "The day you stepped off that stagecoach," he said slowly, like each word cost him something. "The first thing you said was that you weren't pretty." Clara's stomach tightened. She remembered that moment with perfect clarity, the dust and the heat, and the certainty that he would take one look at her freckled face and send her back east on the next coach. "I remember," she said. "I didn't know what to say back. You were standing there, apologizing for how you looked, and all I could think was—" He paused, his grip on her hand tightening. "All I could think was that you were the first person in 3 years who told me the plain truth without dressing it up in pretty words." Clara's breath caught in her chest. "Everyone else who came through here," Wyatt continued, his voice roughening like sandpaper on wood. "The women Mrs. Crane sent before you, they came with all these big ideas, dreams of romance and adventure and making something grand out of nothing. They looked at this land and saw what they wanted it to be, not what it was, and when it turned out to be hard and dry and lonely, they ran." He turned her hand over, traced the lines of her palm with his finger like he was reading a map. "But you looked at this land and saw exactly what it was dying. Used up. Not worth much to anybody. And you stayed anyway. You didn't try to make it into something it wasn't. You just rolled up your sleeves and got to work. Clara's throat felt thick, swollen tight. She tried to speak, but couldn't find the words. You said you weren't pretty, Wyatt said. His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. And I reckon you were right about that. You're not pretty, not the way those women in silk dresses and fancy hats are pretty. Not the way the pictures in those mail-order catalogs are pretty. He looked up at her then, met her eyes fully. But you're real. You're honest. You're the kind of woman who digs for water with her bare hands and hauls buckets through the night and plants seeds in dead soil because you believe something good can grow there. His free hand came up to cup her face. His thumb traced the constellation of freckles scattered across her cheekbone. That's worth more than pretty could ever be, he said quietly. That's worth everything I've got to give. Clara's eyes burned. A tear slipped down her cheek, and Wyatt caught it with his thumb, gentle as rain. I don't need fancy, he said. Don't need silk dresses or perfect skin or any of that. I just need honest, and you're the most honest person I've ever had the good fortune to meet. Clara laughed, a wet, unsteady sound that broke free from somewhere deep in her chest. You're not so bad yourself. Wyatt Hollis. I'm a mess, and we both know it. I know. She reached up and covered his hand with hers, pressing his palm against her cheek. I like you anyway. Mess and all. His face softened. He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. The way he'd done that night in the bedroom when she'd made him promise to stay. Marry me, he said. The words hung in the air between them like dust motes in sunlight. Clara pulled back slightly. What did you say? Marry me. He said it again. Stronger this time. More certain. Proper, I mean, in the church in town, with a preacher and witnesses and all. Not just a piece of paper from some broker in Boston. A real wedding. The way it ought to be done. Clara stared at him. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, in every inch of her body. Wyatt, I know it's soon. I know we've only been... He stopped, took a breath that shook slightly. But I've spent too much of my life waiting for things to fall apart, waiting for people to leave. I don't want to wait anymore. I want to build something that lasts. With you. He reached into the pocket of his work pants and pulled out something small. A ring, simple silver, worn thin by years of being slipped on and off, polished smooth by time and touch. It was my mother's, he said. She gave it to me before she passed on, made me promise to give it to someone who deserved it, someone who'd stay. His voice caught. I think she'd want you to have it. Clara looked at the ring resting in his calloused palm, at Wyatt's face, open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. Are you sure? She whispered. You've known me 4 months. That's not, I'm sure. But what if, I'm sure, Clara? He took her hand and pressed the ring into her palm. Surer than I've been of anything since the day I bought this land. Surer than I've been of anything in my whole life. Clara closed her fingers around the ring. It was warm from being in his pocket, solid against her skin. She thought about all the reasons to say no, the uncertainty of it all, the risk of binding herself to someone she was still learning to understand. She thought about the women who'd come before her, the ones who'd fled this hard land and this harder man. Then she thought about the garden, about the water they'd hauled together through those endless nights, about the rocking chair he'd built with his own hands, about the way he looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world full of shadows and dust. "Yes," she said. Wyatt's face went still as pond water. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you, proper, in the church, with a preacher and witnesses, and whatever else needs doing." She held up the ring, its silver catching the last light of the dying day. "Help me put this on." His hands trembled as he took the ring from her palm. He slid it onto her finger. It was loose. She'd need to wrap some thread around it to keep it from slipping off, and then he was kissing her. Not gentle this time. Not tentative. He kissed her like a man who'd been drowning and had finally found solid ground. His arms came around her, pulling her close. And Clara melted into him like butter in a hot pan, her hands fisted in the worn fabric of his shirt, her heart pounded against her ribs. The basket lay forgotten at their feet, tomatoes spilling into the dirt, and neither of them cared one bit when they finally pulled apart. The stars had come out in earnest. Clara leaned her head against Wyatt's chest, listening to his heartbeat, feeling his arms solid and warm around her. "I love you," she said. The words came out easy, natural, like she'd been waiting her whole life to say them to someone who deserved them. Wyatt's arms tightened. She felt him press a kiss to the top of her head, his lips warm against her hair. "I love you too," he said. His voice was rough, thick with feeling he'd kept bottled up for years. "Reckon I've loved you since you found that water under the oak tree. Maybe even before that. Maybe since you stepped off that stagecoach and told me the honest truth about yourself before I even had a chance to say howdy." Clara smiled against his shirt. "That's a long time to keep quiet about it. I'm not much for words. You might have noticed. I might have." He kissed her again, shorter this time. Sweeter, a promise of things to come. "Come on," he said, releasing her reluctantly. "Let's gather up these tomatoes before the rabbits find them. Then I'll make us some supper, and we can sit on the porch and watch the stars come out. Both of us on the porch. Both rocking chairs are out there now. Have been for 2 weeks. He picked up the basket and started gathering the scattered tomatoes. "Been waiting for the right moment to mention it, I suppose." Clara laughed, bending to help him. The ring on her finger caught the starlight, glinting silver in the darkness. They worked together in comfortable silence, filling the basket with the summer's harvest. When it was full, they walked back to the house, side by side, their shoulders touching with every step. The porch looked different now. 2 rocking chairs sat facing the western horizon, one weathered and worn, the other still pale with newness. Wyatt had placed them close together, close enough that someone sitting in them could reach out and hold hands without stretching. Clara sat down in the new chair. The wood was smooth beneath her palms, sanded to silk. She rocked gently, testing it, and the runners moved easily, quietly, without a single squeak. Wyatt brought out coffee, 2 cups this time. One of them the same battered tin cup he'd handed her on her very first day in Bitter Creek. He settled into the old chair beside her and handed her the tin cup, keeping the newer one for himself. "You kept it," Clara said, turning the cup in her hands. The chip on the rim, the rust stain creeping up the side. She remembered the weight of it, the warmth of the coffee, the confusion and hope she'd felt when he'd offered it to her without a word. "Course I kept it." Wyatt took a sip of his coffee, his eyes on the horizon where the last light was fading to purple. "That cup's special, It's the one I gave to the woman who saved my farm and my fool heart both." Clara reached over and took his hand. Their fingers intertwined. Rough calluses meeting rough calluses. Working hands that knew the weight of buckets and the bite of shovel handles and the slow miracle of seeds pushing through soil. "I came here thinking I wasn't enough," she said quietly. "Not pretty enough, not polished enough, not worthy of much of anything. But you—" she squeezed his hand. "You made me feel like exactly enough. Like who I am is exactly who I was supposed to be all along." Wyatt turned to look at her, his face soft in the starlight. "That's because it is," he said simply. "It always was." They sat together on the porch as the night deepened around them, rocking gently in their chairs, holding hands across the gap. The garden stretched out before them, silver in the moonlight, heavy with the harvest they'd grown together. Crickets sang in the grass. An owl called somewhere in the distance. The wind carried the smell of ripe tomatoes and cooling earth, and something else. Something that smelled like home. Clara looked at the ring on her finger, at the man beside her, at the land they'd fought to save. She thought about the letters still hidden in the barn, the ones she'd chosen not to read. Thought about Ellen, whose seeds had grown into the garden that had brought her and Wyatt together. Thought about the second wife who'd fled into the night, unable to accept a man who'd loved someone before her. She understood now what had really driven that woman away. It wasn't the letters themselves. It wasn't the proof of arguments or disappointments or hard times. It was fear. Fear of not measuring up. Fear of competing with a ghost. Fear of loving someone who might never love her back the same way. Clara wasn't afraid anymore. She squeezed Wyatt's hand and leaned her head against the back of her chair, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. "What are you thinking about?" Wyatt asked. "Everything," she said. "Nothing. Just how lucky I am to be here. Lucky—" He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Woman, you hauled water through 3 nights of suffering and nearly worked yourself to death saving a garden in a drought. That's not luck. That's pure stubbornness. Maybe stubbornness is just another word for luck. Maybe it is at that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, rocking in rhythm with each other. The moon rose higher, full and bright, casting silver shadows across the porch. Wyatt, I'm glad I came here. Glad I answered that advertisement. Glad I took a chance on a stranger who promised nothing but hard work. He turned to look at her, his eyes soft in the moonlight. "I'm glad too," he said. "Gladder than I know how to say." Clara smiled and lifted his hand to her lips, pressing a kiss to his worn knuckles. Tomorrow there would be tomatoes to can, and beans to dry, and a wedding to plan. Tomorrow there would be more work, more sweat, more of the endless labor that came with trying to make something grow in this hard, beautiful land. But tonight, there was just this. 2 people sitting on a porch, holding hands, watching the stars. A garden full of life, a future full of possibility, and a love that had grown, like everything else worth having, from honesty and hard work and the simple willingness to stay. Some stories leave a quiet weight in the chest when they end. This one might be sitting there now, something tender, something familiar, something that doesn't need a name to be understood. Many of us have stood where Clara stood. Not on a dusty porch in Wyoming, perhaps, but in that place where we wondered if who we are could ever be enough, if our hands were too rough, our faces too plain, our hearts too worn by all the years of trying and hoping and carrying on. Some of us have loved someone who built walls around themselves, and we waited, season after season, hoping they might find the courage to let us in. Some of us have been the one doing the building. It's all right if this story stirred up things you thought you'd put away. The feelings that linger about second chances, about being truly seen, about what we're willing to fight for, those can stay unresolved. They're allowed to rest, just as they are, without needing to be tidied up or explained away. What matters is that you stayed until the end, that you sat with Clara and Wyatt through the dust and the rain and the long, hard nights, that you let their story become, for a little while, a quiet companion to your own. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening.